So thank you all. Welcome to Straight Science. This is a public science seminar, evening seminar put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus and UAF Alaska Sea Grant. This is the home office these days. And tonight, it's a topic, rabid foxes, that has come into our area with a little more strength recently. And tonight's speaker, I'm very excited, is Kimberlee Beckmen. We can't be in better hands than Kimberlee Beckmen. She remains the Wildlife Health Veterinarian for Fish and Game, and she's been there for a number of years, long enough to know just about everything there is to know. And she's been the leader of the Wildlife Rabies Surveillance Program for Alaska since 2007. There won't be a question you can ask her that she will not be able to answer about rabies. And with that, let's get right to it. This is an important topic for Nome and for the Bering Strait region. So with that, Kimberlee, take it away.
All right. Well, I'm a UAF alum too, so I know Gay from way back. So I'm hoping, this is a pretty serious issue I'm talking about tonight, but I'm hoping that I can inform you so that you can protect yourself, your family, and your pets against this really serious disease. And, if you look at my title here, you might think that I put pets ahead of kids just because I'm a vet and I'm, animal focused. But actually, that is, you'll see that protecting your pets is how you're going to protect your children. And pets are really a key in this fox rabies situation. So in Alaska, we've done a really great job of using what's called the One Health concept to handle rabies mitigation. You may have heard of One Health before because of a lot of groups in your area are involved in this. And what it means is that we've recognized that human health, animal health, and especially from animal standpoint, animal, dogs, and foxes, as well as environmental health, are all integral in understanding and responding to a zoonotic disease like rabies. And we're instituting that to take care of this problem. And I, first of all, want to identify and acknowledge all the different agencies and personnel that protect Alaskans against Arctic fox rabies, especially in the Bering Strait region and your adjacent areas. And first and foremost is the Department of Health and Social Services section of epidemiology, and that is Dr. Louisa Castrodale is the key state contact for making decisions on rabies testing and treatment and the lay vaccinator program. So the information that I'm going to give you guys tonight is not mine alone. It comes from all these partners, plus the boots on the ground, including many of you that help, with taking action to get carcasses or samples retrieved and shipped off to be tested, and getting dogs vaccinated and helping people through exposures. So here's about what I'm going to talk about tonight, hopefully. I tend to talk really fast when I get excited about a subject, and I'm always excited to talk about diseases. So slow me down. Somebody give me let me know if I'm going way too fast. But I hope to cover these different topics, talk about rabies distribution, spillover, how you can recognize the signs of rabies, what you should do if you see a rabid fox or you get bit by a fox, what's going on in Nome and why, what we as the state and federal government are trying to do to help you, and what actions we're going to take, and most importantly, what you can do to protect yourselves and prevent rabies. So rabies is not just one virus, and it's rabies. When you say rabies, you mean this disease, and this disease is caused by a number of viruses within a family called lyssaviruses, and it's a very ancient disease, been around thousands of years. And dog rabies is the particular one that's been killing people for thousands of years, and we're fortunate that we've eradicated dog rabies in that particular virus in North America by vaccinating dogs. We're not going to be able to eradicate Arctic fox rabies or the fox rabies viruses, but we have eliminated dog rabies, that is different than a dog getting rabies from a fox, which you'll hear about here in just a moment. So the Arctic fox rabies is one rabies virus among the different fox rabies viruses that you'll see here on this map. The dark blue is the distribution of where this virus has ever been detected, Arctic fox rabies. And if anybody's listening from the interior and is worried about the fact that the North Star Burrow is lit up there blue, it is because there was outbreaks of foxes and dogs getting fox rabies back in the 40s and in 1985. Oh, I meant to say, it's interesting that the fox rabies has been around for at least 150 years, recognized in Siberia, and over there they've called it polar madness, Eskimo dog disease, and Arctic dog disease. So I found that kind of interesting anecdote. But anyways, you'll hear me talk a lot and say epizootic region, and epizootic is the word for endemic, or a disease that's always present at some low level. And so this epizootic area that's in black on this map is where Arctic fox rabies is always present at some certain, usually low level. And then you have epizootics, which is epidemic, the same thing, but in animals. And that's when an outbreak of a disease occurs in foxes, and there are exposures to other animals that we recognize. And it usually happens every late winter, early spring, when the Arctic fox come off the ice and encounter red foxes or other wildlife and dogs that are near human habitations. However, rabies has been detected in every month of the year in Alaska. So I want to be clear that rabies is always out there. It's a constant risk, but there are increases in sick animals that we only detect when the animal is near people or it gets reported through surveillance. So the dogma has always been that Arctic fox rabies and the Arctic fox is the reservoir of this virus, and then it spills over into red foxes. But this is not certain. It may be that red foxes are involved in sustaining this virus, but it is called Arctic fox rabies, and Arctic fox are the main species that maintain this virus within the wildlife population. There are different variants. There's actually 3 different variants of this virus in Alaska. And you might be used to hearing about variants because of coronavirus, and different variants transmit more easily or cause more serious disease. And similar things go on with Arctic fox rabies. And these variants seem to be tied to the Arctic fox population structure. And this is probably why there's no endemic rabies in the interior Alaska, where only red foxes occur in abundance and there are no Arctic fox. So I've been talking about Arctic fox rabies, but many of you are thinking, well, hey, we're seeing all these red foxes. We were told this is about red fox rabies. Aren't they the rabies threat? Well, that's where this One Health concept really sneaks in. Environmental change and anthropogenic impacts, that's what people are doing, are impacting fox ecology, and that in turn is impacting the pathogen dynamics for this virus. For example, Arctic foxes travel really long distances, especially in winter over the ice. And when the changes in the sea ice, as you're much more aware of than I am, including fragmentation, this is going to affect their movements. And warming climate is apparently contributed to Arctic foxes moving farther north, and they are occupying areas that were formerly exclusively Arctic fox habitats. And when you get Arctic fox and red foxes together, red fox outcompete the Arctic fox. They displace the Arctic fox out of their denning sites. When they get in fights, the red fox win because they're more aggressive, and they're more adaptable to being around humans, and they're particularly more cunning, maybe smarter even and they're really good scavengers. And both of these species have increased reproductive rates when there's increased food availability. So when there's a lemming boom or there's a lot of garbage around for them to scavenge on, vixens will actually have more kits, and that means they'll be more susceptible foxes to rabies and a higher population density. So then we get increased exposure, increased transmission, and an outbreak occurs the next winter or spring. I mean, think about coronavirus and how to try to stop the wave. We all had to lock down and not go anywhere and stay away from people. And it's the same thing with any infectious disease. When you have more the animals together, more contacts, and more susceptible people that or animals that don't have immunity, that's when the disease takes off. So I mentioned spillover. Spillover to red fox. Spillover is when a maintenance or reservoir host transmits the virus to another species that's a dead end host. And, you know, people are considered a dead end host, and many other animals are considered dead end hosts. But in our situation, there's actually some spillover and spill back, and that's usually via dogs. Dogs have always been and remain the biggest transmission risk to people. And it's preventable because we can vaccinate the dogs so that they don't become this transmission risk. The next most frequent spillover we have is to foxes. And in Alaska, we've had more than a couple of dozen cases in wolves. And wolves can transmit rabies back to dogs or to people. And we've had rabies exposures to people from foxes. And as a matter of fact, in this photograph, that lower right wolf, that wolf does have rabies positive brain tissue. It wasn't yet developing symptoms, but that is one of the cases we had here in Alaska. Now, all mammals are thought to be susceptible to rabies, to getting rabies, but not all of them are effective spreading it. And you might wonder why on this list of other species that have had spillover events, why you don't see lemmings or seals on there or other prey of Arctic fox. And that's for several reasons. First of all, lemmings probably never survive being attacked by a rabid fox. And so they also don't, rodents in general don't produce saliva and spread the virus very effectively. And that's why a rodent bite is not even considered a rabies risk. In the case of seals, although there are documented infections, the seals are so widely dispersed on the ice that people are not encountering one in the way that it could deliver a bite. During large epizootics in foxes, we see cases in coyotes, and we had one just last winter. There's only been one rabid wolverine, and that one laying on my table there is rabid. It's the only rabid wolverine that's been detected in North America. And again, this was picked up through our wildlife surveillance program when one of our caribou capture crew spotted it lying on the tundra with no indication of the cause of death and brought it in, and we tested it. There's probably more rabid wolverines out there, but you know, they're so few and far between and widely dispersed, they're not going to run into people, so we're not going to actually detect it. So it's a matter of detection, probably, not how often spillover occurs. Unfortunately, there has been spillover to humans, and that is our biggest concern, is humans being exposed. Thankfully, there's only been 3 deaths in Alaska, but there have been many exposures and people that have had to be treated with post-exposure vaccination. And you might be wondering, well, why aren't there more with all this rabies around? And I believe it's really because of all the good actions that people are taking in this state. First of all, there's compulsory rabies vaccination by regulation. All dogs and cats must be vaccinated. And in your villages, this is really facilitated through the state lay vaccinator program, which is extremely helpful. Alaska's, as far as I know, the only state in the US where a non-veterinarian can administer a vaccination, and that is for rabies and have it be valid, and that's because of the training and program that we have through the Lay Vaccinator program. We also have a very effective program of reporting potential exposures, such as dog bites and fox attacks, and then very coordinated testing that I'll talk about. And so when a person is exposed or a dog or cat, a dog or fox is positive, or the wild animal is unavailable or unsuitable for testing, we still are able to give treatments, including post-exposure prophylaxis, and that's administered in a timely manner. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So these epizootics that I talked about, they occur on kind of a regular basis in Arctic fox rabies. About every 3 to 5 years, we see this increase in prevalence of disease. And then we recognize some larger, more widespread outbreaks about every 10 years or so. However, this is just what we perceive from the prevalence of detections from reports or exposures and our surveillance work. And so that doesn't mean that there aren't outbreaks going on, larger outbreaks in the remote areas where there aren't people around to notice. This is an example of the number of cases in one of those 3 to 5 epizootics look like. In this particular year, in 2007, there were 44 cases, and you've got a little, if you're able to see the screen, it's showing you how many dogs and foxes were tested, and you can see that in this particular outbreak, it was mostly on the North Slope, and there were equal numbers of red and Arctic foxes that were detected. Now, the most recent outbreak, until the one we're in now, we had an outbreak in 2017 to 2019, and that has really reduced the number of foxes around Prudhoe and Utqiagvik, and so we have very few cases there. But this winter, we've got a high number of cases around Nome and St. Lawrence Island, and we've got some scattered cases around the villages in the YK and Bethel area. So looking at the magnitude of the current outbreak and why we're talking about this tonight, it's pretty remarkable. In addition to these 21 confirmed cases in the Bering Strait region, there are 7 additional reports around Nome and Savunga that were highly likely to be rabid, but were unavailable for testing. And I say they were highly likely rabid because they were attacking dogs or were killed by dogs or were killed in defense of life and property. That's what DLP means, because they had signs consistent with rabies and were thought to be rabid. And we've also, as I mentioned, had a couple of cases in the Bethel and YK area. The most recent one, I think there was one in Nightmute in a fox. And so this is a lot of cases to be reported in a single winter when you compare it to what I just showed you from like 2007. So the fact that, what's going on in Nome, I'm sure that's what you want to know. And the fact that there are cases in other villages, especially Savunga, indicates that there's an increased exposure and disease transmission among Arctic foxes for sure, and either between red foxes or that spillover I was talking about. So we know there's more foxes around, higher numbers, more chances for transmission because there's more contact, more young foxes that have no antibodies, have never been exposed before, don't have any immunity to it. And it seems like around Nome, the virus is circulating in the resident red fox population. And there's a number of factors that occur that bring them in contact with people and dogs, and having a lot of food available and easy scavenging, they breed more, they come around more if there's something for them to eat. And there's also a lot of outside dogs. Maybe there's an increase in the number of dogs being housed outside. And if there's a lower mortality rate of foxes in town, the foxes find a safe haven there, especially if there's no trapping. And there's definitely increased awareness and reporting that can account for a lot of disease detection. So that might be a factor. So you all want to know how to recognize rabies, and I'm sure you've all heard about furious rabies and foxes that are attacking. But that's one of the main signs of two kinds of rabies. We call them two different forms. And the classic furious form is the one you're probably most familiar with. And because the virus is affecting the brain, the foxes will, or dogs will bite and attack inanimate objects and moving objects. They often get hit by cars because they chase the tires. They'll be chewing on rocks, chewing on metal. They'll bite at themselves. They attack anything that moves. So that's why they get in fighting with dogs and get killed by the dogs. They don't display any fear of people at all. And this one alone can be a little tough to tell from a food conditioned or habituated fox that's been fed by people. And we've had a lot of problems up in Prudhoe Bay for a number of years because of people feeding foxes and not knowing that the fox that was approaching them wasn't coming up for food, but was actually coming up to them because they were rabid, and then they would get bitten. In not so much in foxes, but in wolves and lynx, wolverine, or lynx especially, coyotes, a massively quilled face can often be indicative of rabies, and that was one of the cases of rabies in a wolf that was out on the Seward Peninsula that attacked, or maybe it was around Kotzebue, I believe, that it attacked a moose hunter, and the wolf had a face full of porcupines because they were attacking at the porcupine just because it moves. The other form is called dumb rabies or paralytic rabies because the animal acts blind, doesn't appear to be aware of its surroundings, and maybe walking in circles or spinning in circles. They don't run away when they're approached. They appear weak or lame, limping, partially paralyzed, like dragging the hind legs. And then there's this difficulty of swallowing. And I'm sure you've heard about Cujo and Old Yeller and the foaming at the mouth. And we rarely see that in red foxes, although I just recently had a fox come in from Nome that had signs that it had been hypersalivating and foaming at the mouth. And that's because the virus affects the swallowing reflex, and that creating more saliva increases the transmission. And at the end, it causes seizures. And I believe my next slide, I actually have a couple of videos. So this is a fox that was earlier last week in Unalaska, and this shaking of the head, and it is kind of a precursor to a seizure, or we would call it kind of a petit mal seizure. It's possible this fox has distemper, but it's most likely that is rabies. Let me get to the next slide here. This fox, Bill will recognize having sent me this video. This fox does have rabies. It was euthanized and positive, and this is what a seizure looks like. And notice all the disturbed soil around, and the snow is knocked away. This animal has been flopping around and seizuring for quite some time here. Okay, so what should you do if you see a fox acting like this, attacking, seizuring? First of all, you want to protect yourself. You want to warn others and get out of the area. Call the local authority, which is going to depend where you are, whether you're in Nome, well, you can call the police, or you can call Fish and Game. In many other, in your own village, you might have to call the VPSO or VP, or the Office of Environmental Health of your regional corp, somebody who can deal with it. If if there's nobody available, or you need to, you can dispatch that fox right away if it's a clear threat. I mean, if it's attacking you or someone, your dog, or you know, if it's biting at tires and metal and chewing on rocks or coming at you, you want to kill that fox. And that is a legal kill of defense of life and property. You don't need a hunting license. You're protecting human health. So if you do kill the fox, you still got to report it right away, and you have to make sure that you turn in the carcass so that we can test it and dispose of it properly. So what do you do if there's a bite wound? Again, the first thing is to be sure to protect people and pets from further attack. Kill the attacking fox. Don't shoot in the head if possible, but if you do whatever you can to stop the attack and kill that animal. We can still detect rabies in a fox that's been shot in the head. We just can't rule out rabies. We can't make it be certain of a negative test. So if you shoot it in the head or bludgeon it and it wasn't positive, it was negative, we won't be able to tell that, and the person would still have to undergo treatment. So like I said, the only thing we can't do if you shoot it in the head is rule out rabies and say it's negative and say, oh, you don't have to go through all the treatment. So don't not kill it by shooting it in the head if that's the only option you have. The most important thing to do is to wash that wound immediately, thoroughly, with soap and water. Flush it with water, and then flush it with 1% iodine, betadine, if possible. And that cleaning of the wound can reduce the risk of actually contracting rabies by 85%. If you were bitten on the hand by a rabid wolf, a rabid fox, and you washed that wound out, you could reduce the risk of getting rabies by 85% without even any further treatment. I'm not saying don't seek other treatment. I'm just saying the number one thing you've got to do right away is wash out that virus and that saliva. And then you call right away, seek medical care, call your local clinic, and get in touch with the Regional Health Corporation, their Office of Environmental Health, and they will take the next steps. And the next step is to have the healthcare provider or your Office of Environmental Health will call the section of epidemiology in the Division of Public Health. And I got their numbers up there prominently and their website where you can get the forms that would be needed to submit. And it's going to be the section of epidemiology that, I'm sorry for this wordy slide, but they consult with the healthcare provider and on any animal that appears to be having rabies, and they will decide in consultation whether that animal should be tested. And if it's if the animal's been killed, they'll decide on testing. Even if the animal hasn't been killed, they'll decide on whether what treatment is indicated, whether it's a rabies risk exposure and how it should be handled. The virology lab in Fairbanks at the State Virology Lab will test animals that have an impact on a public health decision. That is, does the result of that test mean someone will have to get treated for rabies or not? And so if there isn't an exposure, or if we already know rabies is in the area, we might make a decision to that we don't need to test another animal if there's not an animal, a pet, or a person that's been exposed. And so the section of epidemiology decides on that rabies testing and will recommend the quarantine of a pet or the destruction of a carcass. And they are the ones that recommend the treatment. Fish and Game, you may know, and also USDA Wildlife Services that we're going to talk about, do rabies testing on wildlife. We've done the testing quite extensively, but we can only test those animals that are wildlife that have not exposed a person or a pet. all the human exposure testing is done at the state virology lab or through the CDC. So if you are called on to submit a specimen, you know, because a fox or has attacked someone and you're the designated one, you want to protect yourself. And typically just the head is what they want to have shipped in. And it's important to wear gloves and protect your face, because splashing or getting any of the brain tissue into your eyes or your mouth could also cause an exposure. So these are the recommendations: to wear face protection and eye protection, and wear clothing or outer clothing that can be laundered or disinfected. It's really important to send the appropriate paperwork in with the specimen, and those forms are available on the dhss.alaska.gov website. If you just put rabies in the search bar. And it's their job to make sure that everybody that might have been exposed is contacted. They coordinate determining what's going to be done and arranging for the administration of what's called the post-exposure prophylaxis treatment. And it's also assess what's going on with a dog that might have been exposed. If a dog was involved, they want to check on the vaccination status and determine whether the dog has to be euthanized or if it can be quarantined. If a dog is up on its current on its rabies vaccination, it'll still get another booster and then be confined for 45 days. If it's never been vaccinated, it would have to be quarantined for 6 months with no risk of any human contact. That's very difficult to do, and it's much very, very difficult and not the preferred option. They also will work with the community to ensure that in a rabies outbreak, all the loose and stray dogs are managed, and make sure everybody gets current on their rabies vaccinations for the dogs, and the local regional environmental health office can help with that. Other consideration is disposing of carcasses, and not just ones that you know were rabid, but carcasses from trapped foxes, which I'm going to talk a little bit about here if I have a few minutes. Because even trapped foxes can have rabies in them. So you want to make sure that you dispose of the carcasses appropriately. Don't dump them outdoors where they could be fed on by dogs or other foxes. They should be buried or burned, and I know in the winter it's impossible to bury them or cover them in up to where scavengers can't get in them. Incineration is best, not usually an option. So in villages where there is no option for proper disposal of carcasses, what we recommend for suspect rabies carcasses is to bag them and then put them in a barrel and let them rot, and that make sure that they cannot be scavenged until they're thoroughly stinky rotten, and then the virus will be inactivated that way.
So Kimberlee, this is Gay. You're doing great on time. You got lots of time. So
okay, so I can slow down talking.
Don't feel confined or constrained by time.
Okay. So backing up a little bit, I mean, I've gone through what you should do, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about transmission and why taking certain actions can really help. And I assumed that everybody knew that this virus is shed through saliva and mainly through a bite. But what happens after the bite is that the virus travels up the nerves to the brain, replicates in the brain, and then goes down the nerves to the salivary glands, and then the virus is shed profusely in the saliva. And the brain is inflamed. It's called encephalitis. And that inflammation also causes behavioral changes that facilitate this transmission. That's what causes the animal to bite at things. so that the virus is transmitted. So not all rabies bites result in death, or you know, I'm sure you've heard that rabies is 100% fatal. Well, after symptoms, the signs appear, yes, the disease is fatal, but just getting bitten does not necessarily mean you're going to have a fatal outcome. Like I said earlier, the most important thing is washing that wound. And it also matters where the bite occurs. The farther from the brain, the more time you've got to deal with it and get vaccinations and get immunity. A bite on the nose or the face is the worst and will lead to the most rapid development of disease. And in some cases, the vaccinations can't even help in time. So being bit on the nose by a rabid bat can cause death within days. So the site matters. Being bitten on the big toe, a person might not develop rabies for years. The dose and the route make a difference. So a non-bite exposure could be getting some brain tissue into a cut. That would be bad. We can also aerosolize the brain tissue when sawing off the head, and that's why it's important to wear face protection if you're one of the ones, you know, who had to do that. And not every bite is going to have a lot of virus in it. So depending on how deep the wound is, how severe, and how much virus was being shed from the animal at the time. Immunity is also important because there are people that are exposed to rabies in very small amounts. Like there was a survey looking at antibodies of native trappers up on the North Slope, and many of them, several of them, I should say, had antibodies against rabies that showed that they had been exposed, but they had never developed rabies. But a bite wound is usually going to result in infection unless treatment takes place. But there are natural immunities that have taken place. There also is pre-exposure vaccination for persons like myself who deal with rabies all the time. Our biologists that are at high risk get vaccinated, and workers that do rabies testing get vaccinated. In the case of citizens like yourselves out in the village, you would, if you were exposed to a known rabid animal, you get what's called post-exposure vaccination. And it is excellent for preventing rabies if it's administered in time. And again, it depends on where the bite was and the distance, the brain, and things like that. But that consists of an injection of an immunoglobulin, which is the antibodies essentially to help you, and then a series of vaccinations. And it's not the way that it was many, many years ago. It's not a whole bunch of shots in the stomach. It's actually just right now, I believe it's 3 shots in the arm, and it would be no worse than, in fact, it wouldn't even be as bad as the COVID vaccination. And it might even become reduced down to 2. So it's depending on the particular vaccine, it might be 3, might be 5 shots, but it's not the dozens in the stomach anymore. So another factor that comes in with transmission is the incubation period. And so that's the time from the bite until illness would appear in that animal or person, and they would start shedding virus. And in dogs, it's typically weeks. And that's why that period of quarantine after a dog bites someone is 10 days, because in a dog that was actually shedding virus, they would transmit it and then become sick and die within a 2-week period. But when when a dog gets bitten by a fox, it will develop rabies if it's not immune within probably 3 to 6 weeks. So it's quite a bit longer than when the dog is actually shedding virus. So that's kind of the difference there. I hope I didn't make that too confusing. So if a dog gets bitten by a rabid fox, it itself will develop rabies within several weeks, typically. An Arctic fox, it might take many, many months before it develops rabies. And that's why it's maintaining it as a reservoir host, because they all don't get sick and die immediately. And it's been demonstrated in captivity at UAF that that incubation period runs from 40 days to several months. And there was one case of a fox that was captured as a pup up, or a kit up on the North Slope, and brought into the laboratory, and it developed rabies 7 months later while it was still in quarantine. So it can be very prolonged. In humans, it's known that the incubation period can be weeks, months, or even years. And again, that's dependent on where the bite was and the type of exposure and which rabies virus it was. And so for wildlife, we just don't know. And that's why there's no set quarantine for a wild animal that's been exposed to rabies. We just would euthanize them immediately because we don't have a way to know what the quarantine would be. So what can you do to prevent rabies? The biggest thing is vaccinate your dogs and keep them up to date. Most human exposures and unknown exposures especially are from dogs. If your dog is outside, an outside dog, and it tangled with a rabid fox and you didn't know it, it got exposed, but you didn't, it was so minor you didn't even see the bite. And then that dog developed rabies, it's the one that is going to come in contact with a child or the person, and that unknown exposure won't get treated because you didn't know the dog was rabid. So the most important thing, because the foxes give the rabies to the dogs then expose people more often than foxes exposing people directly. So keep your dogs vaccinated. By law, all dogs over 12 weeks need to be vaccinated, and then get a booster at 1 year of age and then every 3 years after. If your dog is current on its vaccinations and you have proof of that, and your dog gets exposed to rabies from a rabid fox bite, then all we do is give them another booster and observe them for 45 days at home. They don't have to be, shipped off to a kennel or anything like that. You're going to be good to go. If your dog has not been vaccinated, then it's going to be euthanized. If it's expired on its vaccinations, then it'll get a booster and go into quarantine for at least 45 days. The other thing that you can do is remove attractants of foxes, especially secure your garbage and don't leave dog food out. You don't want foxes coming in that have rabies and exposing you. Plus, you don't want to increase their reproductive rates because they've got a lot of food. And fence the dog yard. This does several things. First of all, it protects your kids from getting into the dog yard and inadvertently getting mauled by dogs that are protective of their food, as well as getting exposed to a potentially rabid dog that you didn't know had rabies and was not up on its vaccinations. And you keep foxes from getting into the dog yard and exposing dogs without you knowing that they got in there. So those are the most important actions that you can take. Now, the state recognized that this is a unusual and serious issue in Nome right now, and in Savunga. Not just your ordinary, 1 or 2 cases of foxes that we might expect in a village that's in the epizootic area. This is a dramatic increase in cases and a heightened concern in Nome. So our biologists and technicians at Fish and Game have had to euthanize rabid foxes that were displaying symptoms. They've done a good job of coordinating the response to dogs that have been attacked by foxes and killed foxes. They've been shipping the carcasses in for sampling by me, and then I've sent them off either to CDC or the virology lab. They've helped get samples straight to the virology lab. And we're working on letting people know about rabies and what people should be doing. And we're instituting a surveillance of trap foxes. And since I've got a few minutes to talk about it, I'm going to talk about rabies and trap foxes in just a moment. And because of the overwhelming amount of foxes and the risk to people, we have requested assistance from the National Rabies Management Response Program. And this is through the USDA APHIS Wildlife Services. And their job is to help manage a wildlife disease outbreak. And so next week, there will be several technicians and a rabies biologist specialist coming out to Nome, and they will be reducing the number of foxes in and around town. They will be out at night, actually dispatching foxes. Every one of those foxes will be tested for rabies on site. And I'll talk about that kind of testing in a moment, so that we can see what the underlying rabies rate is in these foxes, and hopefully bring this particular outbreak down to reduce the exposure level to dogs and people. We're working with them, and they're considering whether we can institute an oral vaccination for foxes around the periphery of Nome. This is a bit complicated because the oral bait vaccine that's developed for foxes will not work if it's frozen. So it's not something that can be done during the winter. And also it has to be dispersed at a certain density to get enough foxes exposed and immune with the vaccine. So there are some complications as to why this hasn't been done in Alaska before, but it's going to be considered. And there are some logistics that are being worked out, but we hope to have that happen soon. So the type of testing that'll be done on these foxes that are culled and the trap foxes is one that I've been doing here in the lab. And this is me when I had red hair instead of purple hair. And this is Dave Sennett, who's the wildlife disease technician biologist for USDA APHIS out of Palmer. And we do a test that's called Drit, and it's one that is not cannot completely rule out rabies, but can detect rabies in samples that are not ideal. And what we do is we scoop a little bit of brain tissue out of the back of the skull and put it on a slide, and then we can actually do a benchtop stain and look at a regular microscope and detect rabies virus. And in the picture, if you can see it, these bright red inclusions are actually rabies positive on this stain. The virology lab has to remove the skull and cap and take the entire brain and make slides of very specific sections and do what's called direct fluorescent antibody testing. And that requires a very special microscope that does not travel, and very specialized and lengthy testing. And so, but if their test is negative, then we truly know that the animal doesn't have rabies. And that's kind of the difference here. So with this surveillance program, and I mentioned that we detected it in wolves and that wolverine, we did a big survey. And since 2011, we've tested over 2,000 wildlife species in Alaska, and by this method, to see what the underlying rabies rates was in foxes that weren't, or animals that weren't killed necessarily because of rabies. And what's really interesting is the rates of rabies in foxes that weren't killed because they were rabid. And we can see a little comparison here that when a red fox, and these sample sizes were small, but is hit by a vehicle, the chances of it being positive for rabies are 14.3% for red foxes and 42.9% for Arctic foxes. So that being hit by a car because they're chasing the vehicles is indicative of rabies. When a fox is actually killed as a defense of life and property because it's acting rabid, about half the time the red fox is actually rabid, and it's a small sample, but for 75% of the 4 Arctic fox were positive. We looked at foxes that were trapped during epizootics and non-epizootics and found that trapped foxes, presumed normal, and these were from the Bethel area, in winter, 1% of foxes actually were positive for rabies, and during an epizootic, 3% of trapped foxes were. In Arctic foxes that were trapped during the summer for that depredation to protect eiders that I was telling you about, in a non-epizootic year, 2.4% of them were positive, whereas in an epizootic year, 5% were positive. So again, these animals might not have been yet shedding virus, but the virus was in their brain and we could detect it, and had they survived, they would eventually have succumbed to the virus. So I was supposed to only talk for 45 minutes and I talked for almost an hour. So I didn't leave you much time to ask questions. But I'm putting up my email address here and our website and a brochure that we have available about rabies in foxes. And I guess in the 3 minutes I left, if people want to unmute, they can ask a question.
So thank you, Kimberlee, and we're not shy to stay over and ask questions. So don't expect there may be questions, and don't worry about it. We'll roll with it. It's an important topic. So thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation on rabies. I learned a lot, and I have a couple of questions myself, but I will let audience members either ask, and I didn't say this beforehand, but if you're new to Zoom, using Zoom, on the bottom bar, there's a little thing that looks like a little cartoon. You can either, and it says chat, you can either click on that and type in, you'll get a box like a text. You can type in your like a little email, you can type to the group, or the microphone on the lower left. If it's red with a slash through it, click on it until it's green with no slash, and we'll be able to hear you. But we do have, let me see if they're still on. We do have a caller. And that is, that's impressive because there was no way they could see the slides, but they have stayed on for the entire talk. And I'm going to see if that caller is on the line and if they have any questions, because it is always tough to be the caller on a Zoom call because everyone's used to looking at each other. So it has a 218 area code. If you have any questions, this is your time. All right. We haven't heard anything. James Mason just put a nice complimentary remark in the chat box, which I encourage everyone to give Kimberlee some love. It is not easy to be a straight science speaker on a weeknight, and it was an awesome, awesome presentation. So please feel free to give her a little love there in the chat box. Anybody? I'll open it up now for questions. Either in the chat or amongst the group. We do have Bill Dunker online. He is our Nome area biologist for Fish and Game here in Nome, and he works closely with Kimberlee, especially on this particular issue. And he'll be available to answer questions too. I'll start off then with questions. So one, when you were talking about transmission on Arctic foxes on sea ice and the fragmentation of ice, we're in the Bering Strait region. Is there communications between the rabies program statewide with, say, Chukotka, so that if they're having a rabies outbreak, I never thought of it before you started talking about it, but we have had dogs that are dogs plus foxes and rabbits, and most recently Wolverine, that have wandered out to St. Lawrence Island and even Diomede at times. So these are animals transiting transboundary.
Yeah.
And certainly bringing mainland to islands. Is there any communications that would go across? Is that something that's done?
We're not in, at least I'm not in any direct communication that way, but we do know we're sharing disease. I do know that there is a outbreak in Arctic fox in the Northwest Territories going on at the same time. Interestingly, this winter, we're not having cases up in Ukjavik, and we think it's because the foxes got knocked down in 2017 during that outbreak. We do know that, and we've looked at other diseases that are going back and forth between Russia or Siberia and Alaska. I mentioned a couple times about distemper. That's another virus that affects the brain of foxes and other carnivores. And we were involved in a large study from all those samples I talked about that I took in foxes. We also had those tested for distemper virus, and that those samples were compared to the canine distemper that was killing Amur tigers, to look to see whether the virus that was killing the tigers actually came from Alaska. And we don't have a complete smoking gun, but it actually looks like it was the North American virus that may have affected tigers. So we do have diseases going across the Bering Strait there. And because Arctic foxes travel hundreds, if not, a couple thousand kilometers, there's definitely transmission that's impacted by the ice. And when this outbreak first started, I asked Bill, and he sent me a picture of where the ice was, because I was very concerned about the ice coming down to the Pribilofs or even down to the Aleutians, because there's a great fear, of getting rabies on the Pribilof Islands.
Right.
And that would affect, if the foxes there got infected, then it could affect the seals.
Right. So don't worry about it this year. I don't think we're going to go, we already hit maximum extent, I believe, already for the year. So I think we're in retreat mode at this point.
But with that retreat, then, the foxes have less habitat on the ice. There's going to be more of them coming on land, and so it's.
So interesting. Well, there are ways we can communicate sort of publicly information over to our neighbors, and maybe that's something we should be thinking about, just to make them aware if we're having a problem.
I would not be surprised if they were not having an outbreak there too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions from other folks for Kimberlee Beckmen or Bill Dunker regarding rabies in Nome or rabid foxes in our region? Really excellent, Kimberlee, presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, while everyone's.
And if you think of questions later, again, I put my email up there if you can see it. If you can't see it and you want to hear it, it's DFG, as in Department of Fish and Game, .dwc.vet at alaska.gov. So that stands for Department of Fish and Game, Division of Wildlife Conservation, veterinarian. So,
can you put it in the chat box, and that way people can lift it right off the thing?
Yeah, that one might be easier.
It's tough always on a screen. And while you're doing that, I did have another question, and that was during your presentation, you had all these cool little facts about the Wolverine and other people that were like, the guy gets attacked in Candle in 1914 by a dog.
Yeah.
But you also had reindeer question mark teller. Now that seems like it's really appropriate for the region, and the question mark kind of got me on reindeer.
Well, I just didn't remember it was teller. I know it was reindeer,
okay.
and there was more than one, and it was out your way. And I tried to look that up. I was trying to put my chat in. I having trouble figuring out how to chat to everyone.
Pull down the arrow. It should.
Yeah, yeah, it's like because other people were chatting to me privately.
I'll type it in. I'll type it in, Kimberlee. Don't worry
Okay,
about it.
Okay. Yeah, so there were multiple cases. I think there were 2 in reindeer in an outbreak, and I thought it was teller, but it was somewhere north of Nome. And it was in a private reindeer herd. And then there was a case in a caribou and the same year, and that caribou actually was seen attacking a sign on the haul road.
Holy
And
cow.
the person stopped, and the caribou turned around and attacked him, and he shot it in defense of life and property and turned it in, and it was tested rabid. Yeah.
Wow, my goodness. I wouldn't that's interesting. Never heard of such a thing.
Yeah.
You know that can happen.
Yeah, the lynx last year was a really bad one. You guys probably heard about it out in Guyana, where a lynx came in. There were some children who were playing ball or playing a game called Monkey in the Middle, which I'm not exactly familiar with. But anyways, this lynx came in and jumped on one of the children.
I did not hear about that, but
yeah, and then they killed it. Fortunately, they killed the lynx, and it was rabid. And the child was fortunately not bitten, but the lynx was right in their face. Yeah, and that was the first lynx that we'd had in Alaska. So it's interesting. There've been lynx elsewhere, but that was the first lynx we've had here. Had a couple of river otters.
So know that on St. Lawrence Island, besides foxes, there's been a number of sightings of wolverine recently. If that is helpful as you move forward.
Yeah, and you know, it was a year or 2 ago. We had we got a wolverine that was out on the ice out off of Prudhoe.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, global climate change doing all sorts of weird things for where animals are ending up.
So Kimberlee Beckmen's email address is in there, and then the Nome, I'm going to throw in the Nome office phone number there for everyone. And it sounds like we're going to have this crew of people that are going to be eradicating foxes within Nome, and that will be, do you know when again that?
I think they'll arrive this weekend, and they'll be out there for 2 weeks, and they may be able to make a trip for a few days out to Sabunga.
Okay.
Maybe Gamble also, but that's not for certain yet. I mean, this has all come together in just the last 3 or 4 days, thanks to Bill Dunker and Mark Pratt, who's of the USDA down in Palmer.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time tonight, and you too, Bill, for providing information this way, and this will get distributed out, I'm sure, throughout the region.
I have a question.
Oh,
really
Muriel.
quick.
Go ahead,
Thank
Muriel.
you.
I'm talking away.
Oh, thank you. Won't be too much. I have just a couple of questions.
Go for
So
it.
you mentioned that one of the main drivers possibly of rabid foxes coming into town is the trash, you know, loose trash or trash not in the dumpster. So are rabid foxes, their appetite is normal, I guess, so they do search for food? I wasn't sure.
The thing, there's twofold there. Well, the foxes that I examined that were rabid this winter were obese. So they had been eating garbage. They were fatter than foxes that are normal foraging on lemmings and things like that. And
oh, okay.
I have examined so many hundreds of foxes. I know what their body condition should be. So,
Okay.
and when foxes have a ready food supply, they breed more. So you have more kits, which has more susceptible animals. And again, that's an epidemiological thing, that the more susceptibles you have, the more population you have, you know, you're gonna have more disease spread. Plus that draws them in and keeps them living in town if they have a ready supply.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm from the Northville Borough. I live in Barrow, and you're right, we haven't really had any cases this winter. But my other question is, so do the foxes, especially this time of the year, do they prefer the daytime, the nighttime, or does it really matter to them?
I may let Bill answer that question.
Hi, everybody. This is Bill Dunker again, the Unit 22 area biologist here in Nome. As far as their behavior, it's my understanding that they're typically crepuscular, meaning they're going to be active, you know, in the early morning hours and in the evening hours. But certainly, you know, once we get into the summer months and things like that, when we have a lot of daylight, some of that, you know, typical behavior kind of goes out the window, and they'll be, you know, can be observed feeding at all hours of the day. But at this time of the year, I would expect them to be somewhat more active during the, you know, the early morning and evening hours, and then possibly through the evening as well.
Yeah, and
Okay.
then animals that are normally only active at night, when they develop rabies, you'll see them out in the day. So with raccoons, you know, they normally forage at night. If you see raccoons during the day and they're acting weird, that's a bad sign. And same thing with bats. Bats out during the day, not a good thing. So I would think that in foxes, it would affect their behavior time of day also.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great presentation.
Thanks. My dog is about to Zoom bomb us again. he's bringing me his toy. So, well, I guess if there's no more questions.
Thank you, Kimberlee, and thank you, Muriel. I was on mute there. Just wanted to say thanks for the shout out from the North Slope Borough. We appreciate that. Again, looks like Kimberlee, you're getting a lot of love in the chat box, so that's nice. You did a great job. And if there's no more questions, speak now. If not, we'll let Kimberlee get on and everyone else get on with their evening.
All right. Well, thank you for the invite, and you know, I'd love to talk about other diseases some other time.
We'd love it. And maybe we'd like to hear the outcome of what happens in the next 2 weeks, you know, when you guys have all your results back and things like that. I don't know if that's you, Kimberlee, or Bill, but it would be great to hear what the outcome is for when we have a little bit more time and that crew of people are able to get the foxes and get them sampled and go to Sifunga.
So yeah, just to make a pitch for it, I'm giving one of the presentations on the Zoom webinars that are put on by Fish and Game, and I'm going to be talking about caribou diseases on April 5th. And I can send you the announcement and the link for that. And actually, Lincoln Perrette is giving a talk, and many of you might know Lincoln. I think his is tomorrow night. And it's a series of 3 talks about caribou biology, and I get the final one on disease. And it's advertised on the Facebook page of the Interior Fish and Game Facebook page. But I can send you the link so that if anybody asks, they can get it through you. So that's my next talk I got to work on.
All right. Well, for us here in Nome, the next Straight Science will be April 1st next week, and it's going to be Catherine Burchak with the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center Marine Mammals Lab, and it's going to be an interesting talk. There's a series of hydrophones, underwater microphones across from the Aleutians up to Utqiagvik underwater. that are anchored to the seafloor, and they are listening for the songs of whales, seals, and walruses, and getting the timing and seasonal movements of the animals singing underwater. And in the last 5 years, there's been a bit of a shift, and she's going to explain what they found.